to the May 4th edition of Global Dialogue. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're pleased to bring a special presentation of Global Dialogue today to talk with Professor Mark Katz about Iran and Russia. And we welcome Mark to join us this evening from Fairfax, Virginia. Mark, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors and partners for the program tonight. We're very appreciative of Belmont University Center for International Business for their support of the World Affairs Council, as well as the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. And we'd also like to thank the George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government for producing Mark with us this evening, as well as the Wilson Center Kennan Conversations series. Our topic tonight, Russian leaders in Tsarist times, the Soviet decades, and the modern Russian Federation have had designs on its periphery to the south for centuries. They've made advances and suffered setbacks, whether through external or internal disruptions. However, Russia has always sought to return its glance to the Middle East as an area to exert its influence. So tonight we're going to talk about one aspect of Moscow's influence and relations in the region, its connections with Iran. To do that, we have the preeminent scholar on this topic, Professor Mark Katz. Mark Katz is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University's Schar School. He earned a BA in international relations from the University of California at Riverside in 1976, a master's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in 1978, and a Ph.D. in political science from MIT in 1982. He was a visiting scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington in 2017, and then at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. And I believe Mark is still working with the Finnish Institute. During 2018, he was a Fulbright scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and was then the 2018 Sir William Luce Fellow at Durham University in the UK. And I was privileged to join Mark at Durham for his presentation as the Luce Fellow. That was a wonderful event. In February 2019, he was appointed a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Professor Katz's research focuses on Russian foreign policy, especially towards the Middle East and the international dimensions of revolution. Against the backdrop of years of conflict, rising tensions, and mass population movements in the Middle East, interventions of Russia in the region have caught attention of the world. Professor Katz, as I mentioned, is also a non-resident scholar at the Atlantic Council, the Rafik Uri Center for the Middle East. He is the author of numerous books on Soviet and Russian foreign policy, especially toward the Third World. He has scores of archived video briefings and seminars, and enough articles, papers, and reports to fill the Manhattan telephone book, for those who remember what a telephone book was. And he is a veteran of the Tennessee World Affairs Council's Distinguished Visiting Speaker Program, with an earlier appearance in person in Nashville and previous virtual visits with us with the support of the Wilson Center's Kennan Conversation series. Professor Mark Katz, welcome to Global Dialogue. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for so much for having me. I only wish that could be an in-person visit like it was, I guess, 4 years ago to the wonderful city of Nashville. And although I do remember when you come in person as a speaker, Pat Ryan works you hard. I think I had 5 or 6 events that he had me programmed for. So
we wouldn't want you to leave only with a Tootsie's T-shirt and just one appearance. So we're pleased to share you around town, especially with one of our board members, Dr. Susan Haynes, who was your dissertation student at George Mason. So
we're very proud of her. Her dissertation was published as a book, which was really, really remarkable.
Well, we're pleased that we have that connection and that We learned of Susan through you, or we learned of you through Susan. I can't remember which it was, but welcome and thanks. We have a lot of material to cover here. The last thing in the world I want to do is ask a professor to tell us the background on all of this, but we probably need a little background and your idea, maybe some opening remarks of where the issues rely on the question of the Russian-Iranian relationship and why it's important to the United States. So the
Very
floor is
good.
yours, Professor.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pat. So yes, I'll try to be brief here. Russia and Iran is a fascinating subject. Russia and Iran, as we all know, have been working closely together, especially in Syria, where they helped save the Bashar al-Assad regime from being overthrown and to regain much of the territory it had lost to its various opponents. And underlying the Russian-Iranian cooperation on Syria are three common interests. One is their common antipathy toward the United States and the West more broadly. Second is their common fear of so-called color revolution or democratic revolution, which they see as an American effort designed to rally popular opposition to both the Russian and Iranian governments, among others, with the aim of overthrowing them, as well as replacing them with pro-American regimes, which may or may not be democratic. And third, Moscow and Tehran share a common fear of Sunni jihadists, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which Moscow and Tehran both portray the US and some of its allies as supporting. Now, all three of these common interests come together in Syria. Neither Moscow nor Tehran wishes to see the secular Arab nationalist Assad regime, based on Syria's Alawite minority, overthrown and replaced either by pro-Western forces or Sunni jihadists, which Moscow and Tehran both fear could arise in their own countries. Now, but what's important to understand is that despite this common interest that they have, there have been and still are important differences and disagreements in the Russian-Iranian relationship. And while Iranians, as we all know, are still resentful over the US role in the 1953 downfall of the Prime Minister Mossadegh and support for the Shah afterward until his downfall in 1979, Iranian resentments against Russia go back much further. These include the Tsarist conquest of Iranian territory in the early 19th century, Tsarist intervention to crush the constitutional revolution in the first decade of the 20th century, Soviet support for the so-called Gilan Soviet in northwestern Iran after World War I, Soviet occupation of northern Iran during World War II and their initial refusal to leave, Soviet support for Azeri and Kurdish communists after World War II, and then Soviet support for Saddam Hussein during the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War. More recently, Iranians have been unhappy about the long delay in Russian completion of the Iranian nuclear reactor at Bushehr that they agreed to work on in the early 1990s, but only finished around 2012 or so. They're also unhappy about Russian hesitancy about selling certain weapons systems to Iran. What I think is interesting is that the Iranians, they finally did get the S-300 air defense missile system, but Turkey has the S-400. So, Iran doesn't have that. And I think in what especially concerns the Iranians is Russia's increasingly friendly relations with Iran's regional rivals, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and even Israel. Now, the Russian-Israeli relationship is of a special concern to Tehran. There have been numerous press reports about a Russian-Israeli so-called deconfliction agreement regarding Syria, whereby Russian armed forces do not interfere with Israeli attacks on Hezbollah and even Iranian forces so long as Israel doesn't target Russian ones. Tehran, though, is hardly in a position to break with Moscow over even serious disagreements. For if it did, whom could Iran turn to for support? Not America, obviously. And while the Chinese-Iranian economic partnership is growing, China is not willing to play the active military role that Russia does. In addition, China also has good relations with all the American allies in the Middle East that Moscow does. What Iran and Russia each fear about the other is that the other is going to cut a deal with America at its expense. That the Iranians have seen Moscow's desire to work with Washington as limiting Russian willingness to sell sophisticated weapons to Tehran. And the recently released Zarif audio tape revealed that Moscow, for its part, feared that the signing of the Iranian nuclear accord in 2015 would lead to a broader Iranian-American rapprochement that would reduce Russian influence in Tehran. And so they were trying to get the Iranians not to go along. Now, several American presidents have sought to work with Russia against Iran, but this has not worked. The Russians don't fear a nuclear Iran as much as the Americans and their regional allies do. Further, Russia benefits from the continuation of Iranian-American hostility. American sanctions against Iranian petroleum exports helps Russia along with other exporters. Besides, continued Iranian-American hostility, while Russia gets along with both Iran and its regional rivals, bolsters Moscow's claims to be able to be a more effective mediator, even if it never quite seems to be able to accomplish this. Now, Moscow certainly doesn't want any kind of regional settlement that leads to Iran withdrawing from Syria and leaving Russia with the prospect of undertaking the main burden of propping up Assad that it currently shares with Tehran, or being unable to do so without Iran. Instead, Moscow needs Iranian-American hostility to continue in order to better pursue Russian ambitions in the Middle East. So while Moscow and Tehran have numerous differences and don't have much trust in each other, Russian-Iranian cooperation is likely to continue so long as both of them share a common antipathy toward the United States. And this is something that is also likely to continue since both the Russian and the Iranian leaderships fear the impact of friendly relations with the US far more than they fear hostile relations with it. And I'll just stop there since I know we have only a short period of time.
Well, Mark, as with most things in the Middle East, it's complicated. On the one hand, this, on the one hand, that. And before we get into it, let me just remind our audience, we are looking forward to their questions and for them to please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we will turn to them as we see them related to our conversation, but certainly at the end in our Q&A period. Let me ask you one question, dropping back a little bit on the bigger picture for Americans. And, you know, the United States has been engaged politically in the Middle East since the end of the Second World War, and militarily, active militarily, since the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis and the revolution. We've sent 500,000 American troops to the deserts of Saudi Arabia, first to protect the oil fields and then to reverse the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. And then later, we invaded Iraq with the intention of finding WMD, and the net result was removing the bulwark of Iranian expansionism potential from right in the middle of what is now called the Shia Crescent, extending from Iran to the Mediterranean. You know, Americans are justifiably worn out by the investment of blood and treasure in the Middle East and the diversion of our attention from other global issues. Should we still be worried about what happens over there? And if so, why?
Well, you know, I think we do need to be concerned about what happens in the Middle East. You know, people say that you know, petroleum is not going to be used, but you know, the world still relies on petroleum. We do, and it's going to be with us for quite some time. So, and of course, the Middle East, especially the Persian Gulf area, has so very much. So I think that we need to be concerned about this part of the world, and that's just the way it is. You know, second, you know, there's many Americans who are especially concerned about Israel. And the thing about that is that if they're concerned about Israel, they're also concerned about Israel's neighborhood. And so I think that they would prefer that there would be governments in the area that are either, simply not hostile, but also willing to cooperate. And I think one of the things that we have seen, with these Abraham Accords is that there is a degree of cooperation. And of course, what underlies it is the common fear of Iran that both our Israeli and our Arab Gulf Arabs share. But thirdly, even if these two things were not issues for us, whether there was oil or whether there was, simply a Palestinian state, I think it matters to the United States if the government that controls the two Muslim holy cities is willing to work with the US, or if it is totally hostile toward the US and the West and promotes jihad against them. So I think that we have a lot at stake, whether we know it or not. And, I think that, obviously it's not been easy. It's been something of a mess, but it could be a lot worse. It could be a lot worse, and the problems won't be contained. So I think that we have a very strong interest in seeing that, in my view, conflict resolution takes place, that we see development, that we see, I would argue that, democratization. And also, I just think that, yeah, we've made a lot of mistakes. We've spent a lot of, money and, lost many, many lives. But look, if we just withdraw, things are not going to get better. And there's an old adage about how, there's no such thing as non-interference in international relations, because when you decide you're not going to interfere somewhere, that means basically you're acquiescing to the victory of whoever is strongest in that particular contest. And I think that I see in my good friend Mushraf Jouajati is in the audience, very concerned about Syria, and he's constantly reminding his friends, on Facebook that, that if the U.S. isn't involved in Syria, then the Syrian people are going to suffer. They may suffer even if we are involved, but they're definitely going to suffer if we're not. And so I think that there's lots of reasons, both sort of realpolitik reasons, and I think humanitarian reasons for us to be involved. Could we do a better job? You bet. But that doesn't mean that because we haven't done a good job, that we should simply leave. We have to figure out how to do a better job. It's in our interests, and it's in the interest of the Middle East.
Well, in the interest of time, I think we need to set the scene a little bit, but I'll try to be brief with my questions here, and perhaps you can just touch the tip of the iceberg on some of these things. Let's start with Iran. We know that they want to get back into the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, as it was agreed to in 2015. We know they have expeditionary activities and spheres of influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere. We know they have an adversarial relationship with their Gulf neighbors. We know that the Revolutionary Guard appears to be ascendant in politics. And we know that many Iranians are fed up with the government, which is about to have an election and a new leader. So can you kind of set the scene, describe what the view from Tehran is of the neighborhood and the external actors in the region?
Well, I think that the Iranians, obviously the Islamic Republic, has had big ambitions. I think, though, that in many respects they feel kind of isolated. Now, of course, their isolation is partly due to their own behavior, but I think they look to the west of them and they see a huge sea of, Sunnis, and in fact, sort of all around them, in the Muslim world. They're one of the few, majority Shia countries, and so I think that a lot of their sort of export of revolution behavior is to to forestall what they feel is going to happen if the Sunnis sort of rally themselves, and I think this is why they're fearful of groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, which they worry that this is not these aren't just movements that in fact certain Sunni governments support them. This may be an overblown fear, but I think that international relations is something that everyone's a worst case analyst. The thing is that for each of us, the worst case is something different. And I think for the Iranians, it's being overwhelmed by Sunnis. Now, I think that in terms of the Iranian nuclear accord, from their point of view, it was the Trump administration that withdrew. Now, of course, their behavior since then of getting out of compliance has not been helpful, and the Biden administration sort of wants them back in, and there's this dance about, well, who is going to move first, etc. I think we have to move at the same time, but there is this concern, in other words, that I think most people would like to would agree that some limitations on the Iranian nuclear program is a good thing, but the Iranians are obviously not limiting themselves in the regional context. And I think we just have to ask ourselves, what's more likely, a nuclear armed Iran with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or without it? Because I think if it's not reinstated, that they're simply going to acquire nuclear weapons sooner rather than later. Now, I think also, we don't like their regional behavior, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, the list goes on. I think that for Americans, and this was true, I remember during the 1970s, we don't like to compartmentalize. In other words, we had the same issue with the Soviets in the early 70s, pursuing nuclear arms control, but they were competing with us and very effectively in the third world, through regional conflicts, Southern Africa, Horn of Africa, Southeast Asia, Afghanistan. And I think that I think it would behoove Americans to have sort of a more compartmentalized attitude. In other words, to be able to cooperate where you can cooperate, but really compete where your interests are at odds, and not hold the area of common interest hostage to solving all problems. And this is what we've typically done, and I think not necessarily to our advantage.
Well, domestic politics in the U.S. is not helpful in that regard. Let's just touch on Russia a little bit. You gave us a rundown of the Russian relationship with the Gulf over the years. Anything else we need to know about the relationship? I know at the height of the Syrian conflict, Iran invited Russian bombers into a base to stage for attacks into Syria, and then they were asked not to do that again. I think some people in Tehran spoke up about it. So it is a complicated relationship. Sometimes hands off, sometimes embracing. What should we know about, where do you come down on how the thinking is in Russia towards Iran?
I think that, from the Russian perspective, as I indicated, the worst case is not a nuclear armed Iran. The worst case is an Iranian American rapprochement. Because the thing is that even with Iranian American hostility, the Iranians don't go out of their way to be polite to the Russians. That they pursue their interests pretty strongly in opposition to the Russians if need be. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see is that in Syria, with the Assad regime more or less being saved, I think it looks like Iranian Russian competition for influence, and of course for contracts, for reconstruction, is starting to come up. And so I think that the Russians, that they don't regard the Iranians as a reliable ally. And they, we don't, obviously we don't see peace between Iran and the US breaking out anytime soon, but this is what the Russians really fear. So if the JCPOA is not restored, Moscow will not be unhappy. It seems to me that they would prefer that situation. But so long as Iran wants it, Russia cannot oppose it.
When we opened with the question about the view from Tehran, you used the phrase exporting revolution. Is Iran truly exporting revolution anymore? It seems that they're just exporting trouble. not necessarily revolution. And if they are exporting revolution, that would seem to be a distractor for the Russians.
Well, I think that what they do is they're supporting, Shia groups in various places. Obviously, Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, which are an important fighting force in Syria. They support Shia militias in Iraq, Shia militias in Yemen, and and in Syria, I think what we're seeing, the Assad regime is based on this Alawite minority. It's often described as an offshoot of Shiism. This was only something that was kind of recognized relatively recently, I think, by the Ayatollah Khomeini. In other words, it really is sort of a different branch. It's kind of a hybrid religion, if you will. It's not, many Sunni Muslims don't consider them Muslims at all. But what we do see the Iranians doing is trying to convert people to their own Shiism in Syria. In other words, this is one way they're trying to gain influence. And so, they want to do this. They see this as being in their interests. So they do have an expansive version of what they want. And I think, again, in other words, that they're doing it in their mind defensively. In other words, better that they convert others to Shiism than that those others be converted to Sunniism, especially Sunni jihadism. So they regard this as not just spreading their own power, but forestalling the growth of their enemy's power.
So I'll stick to my contention. They're mostly exporting trouble. Let's
revolution is always trouble. So.
Well, yeah, one man's freedom fighter, exactly. What about our friends in the Gulf? You talked about the United States needing to maintain a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, and despite the conversations lately about Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince, etc., the relationship is so complex on many levels that it's difficult to unravel what it would look like if it was not a friendly relationship. But apart from specifically Saudi Arabia, we have relations with the other GCC countries. Some of that is complicated. The embargo of Qatar by some of the others, and the relationship between Oman and Iran is not the same as Bahrain and Iran. So are the Gulf Arabs, our friends in the Gulf, are they concerned about U.S. staying power? Are they looking at Russia and China as being the next additions in the Netflix series? How does that work out?
Well, they are concerned about U.S. staying power, but I think, Pat, you and I know, they've been concerned about this since the 1970s, when they worried about, British staying power. Of course, they left, and then the Americans sort of more fully came in, but they've been worried about it ever since then, especially after the Iranian Revolution.
Bahrain, and after the Yom Kippur War, asked the United States to leave. We had a base there and a ship base there. I don't want to date myself, but that was my first assignment in the Navy back in the day. And Bahrain, after the Yom Kippur War, asked us to leave, and I think we papered over it, and it worked out. But yeah, it's complicated.
Right, and of course, after the 79 revolution, I think they're very happy that we didn't leave. So, I think that one of the curious things is how our at a time when U.S.-Russian relations are deteriorating, every single one of our Middle Eastern allies has good relations with Moscow. It's really very curious. Now, some of our Israeli and Gulf Arab allies are concerned that the U.S. might get too close to Iran. This was their concern under the Obama administration somehow. So the reaction is to improve relations with Russia, which has far better relations with Iran, long-standing relations with Iran. And so it's very odd sort of reaction in one sense. But I think also what our Middle Eastern allies feel is that, in other words, with the Russians, they know that the Russians are capable of helping Iran if they want to. And so our Middle Eastern allies, they court the Russians. In other words, they want to give the Russians an interest in not supporting Iran, or at least not so much against them. And that's essentially what they've done. In other words, I think that for our Middle Eastern allies, they fear what Russia can do, but what they also understand is just how venal the Russian leadership is. In other words, that they will respond to money, as Putin, his cronies around him, that he has to buy their support. And let's face it, there isn't much available money from Iran under sanctions. There's lots of money available from the Arab Gulf countries. And also, I think for the Israelis, that there's technology, there's this is an important partner for Moscow in many respects. So go ahead.
We have a question from Adam Blanco, who notes the recent news that Prince Mohammed bin Salman has publicly stated he's seeking better relations with Iran. I didn't see that he made a public statement. I saw there were news reports that that was going on. I think there was a meeting between a Saudi and an Iranian in Iraq. But Adam asks, is this overture sincere, and why now?
I don't know. I think that there have been occasions like this in the past where the Saudis and the Iranians have gotten to talk to each other, and I think what they found is that, yeah, they really do disagree. They don't actually have much in terms of common interest. I think from the Iranian position has been toward the Gulf Arabs, all our problems are due to the American presence. So if the Americans would just leave the Gulf, we would all get along just fine. Well, if the Americans leave, Iran's the very strongest power. And I don't think our Gulf Arabs allies really want to find out what life will be like without the US, but with Iran definitely there. So they're not reassured, it seems to me, by these kinds of overtures. On the other hand, I think they do have an interest in tamping things down and making sure that things don't get out of hand. So, and also if the US is there, in other words, that if we have their back, then they can afford more readily to talk to the Iranians. In other words, see what they can, get with them or what have you. So it's sort of a dual track strategy, if you will. But we'll see how long it lasts, because often these Iranian Gulf Arab dialogues don't last for very long.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I wish we had more time to pursue it, but the question of the GCC preparedness vis-a-vis Iran and the decades of arms sales and training, it begs the question, how is it that the Gulf Arabs could not stand up militarily and forcefully against Iran? But that might be a tease too far. Let me ask a question. You answered your friend Murhaj, who earlier asked about Syria, but he asked specifically about targeting Iranian targets from Israel in Syria. How does Moscow manage the contradictory policy of standing still for that?
Well, it does. It's magic. It's I
Okay.
think that the thing about it is that I think that the Russians, they have a history of they work cooperatively with someone, but once the common enemy is in retreat, then they work against that ally. And I think the beauty for the Russians is that they see themselves in competition with the Iranians in Syria, but they don't have to do anything about it because the Israelis will do something. And why not just let them do it? Now, for the Iranians, I think that the thing is that they know this is happening, but what can they do? In other words, who can they turn to for support? There's literally no one. And so they have to, I think it's just a cost of doing business for them. In other words, that they, we're not exactly sure of what the Israelis are not hitting, what the Iranians are getting away with, what Hezbollah is getting away with. Obviously, Israeli intelligence is, famous for being extraordinarily knowledgeable, but something tells me that the Iranians are pretty good at this as well. So it's simply a cost of business for them, and it's not like they're going away. Because I think that the Iranian belief is that they're bigger, they're stronger, that eventually that they will prevail. There's just more of them and their Shia allies than there are of the Israelis. I don't know the answer, but everyone seems to be operating under the premise that time is on their side.
We have a question from Xiaoning Huang, who asks, he talks about regarding Russian fear, the US should logically work to reconcile with Iran somehow, but it's probably a rhetorical question with the likelihood of rapprochement. I think we're miles apart and probably getting further apart with the ascendancy of the Revolutionary Guard and the upcoming elections. We're losing the incumbent president, Mr. Rouhani. Why would he asks how likely is rapprochement, and
Mhm.
that's a open
Mhm.
question down the
Well,
road.
it's a very good question. It's a very good question, and because it seems to me that certainly, since the end of the Cold War, several U.S. administrations have tried to work with Russia against Iran, and that hasn't gotten very far. No one's tried working with Iran against Russia. It just the premise seems ridiculous. Although I would note that in the John Bolton memoir, In the Room Where It Happened, that Bolton describes President Trump constantly having this idea that he could make a deal with the Iranian leadership, and that the Iranian leadership wanted to make a deal with him. In other words, that Trump, in a certain sense, had this amoral realpolitik vision. And I think what made it not work was that, as we saw with North Korea, is that he really thought that somehow, good relations between two leaders alone would be good enough, and it's really not when you have governments with very different interests. And I think for the
I think
Iranians,
he also dangled in front of North Korea the prospect of building resorts on the coastline of North Korea, and that
right? And from
those incentives just weren't in
but
the
from the
cards.
point of view of Donald Trump, that's his business. That sounds good to him. Surely it would sound good to someone else. Make money, through hotels and golf. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
And the North Koreans, and if it had worked, that would have been fine. I think that he even got less far with the Iranians because, unlike North Korea, Iran is a far more divided polity. In other words, that you have rivalries, and the moment that any one side is seen treating with the US, then the other side will pounce on it. And so it's just literally within Iranian domestic politics, very difficult to make any kind of deal with the US without hurting your own position inside Iran. And I just don't think that Trump understood that. In other words, in his mind, what he saw was the Nixon in Beijing moment, and I think that's what he was hoping for. But obviously, the Nixon Kissinger diplomacy was helped by the fact that we had a common opponent, the Soviet Union at the time. That's what really drove this. And even then, the Sino-Soviet split had been going on for 15 years before Nixon gets to China. So that is the thing, is that there needs to be some common uh, problem forcing rapprochements. Rapprochements can occur, but they don't occur just because you have leaders who are looking for a photo op or think it would be a good idea. Something has to impel people who don't want to do this to change their minds. In other words, to get over what their proclivities are. And at the moment, there is no such incentive for the Iranians. Now, people might think, well, what about all the maximum pressure campaign that we've launched? And the thing is that this actually doesn't really bother the Iranian leadership. that it may be hard on the Iranian people, even them to some extent, but that shows everyone that they can blame all their problems on the American policy, not their own incompetence or corruption. And so it actually helps them in many respects.
Mhm.
So, again, what they really fear is good relations. And so the question really is a good one. And I have a feeling that eventually, at some point, there will be a better Iranian-American relationship. But I have a feeling that it's going to have to be under very different circumstances and probably with a different leadership in Tehran before anything like that happens. But we
Yeah,
shouldn't give up hope.
yeah, we see some of these older leaders around the world who uh, forecast, intelligence, and otherwise suggest that their actuarial tables have run the course, but they just keep hanging on. I don't get it. Let's turn to a question from Gina Chinali, who says that MBS has also launched a PR effort to emphasize that Shiism is not an issue in Saudi Arabia and that sacred texts remain open to interpretation. And she asks how the Iranian government might respond. Would they welcome a similar openness towards Sunnis? And she mentions that having worked extensively in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, she wonders if this could be a charm offensive by Saudi Arabia to an audience beyond its own domestic arena. I don't think the evidence is in yet, but what do you think? I suspect nothing that comes out of Riyadh is not vetted for the impact on multiple levels.
Right. I just think that certainly, Saudi Shias, whom I know, that they're not buying this. That they have, the Saudi government is very much anti-Shia, and they are second-class citizens. I think that the PR effort is aimed mainly at the American Western audience concerned with humanitarian affairs, human rights, and not so much at the others. And I think the Iranians are not exactly tolerant of Sunnis either inside Iran. So I think that it'd be a real contest to see, you know, who treats the minority more badly, whether the Iranians do or whether the Saudis do. But I don't think that the Iranians are going to be very impressed with this.
Yeah. Adam asks, are the Russian and Iranian governments losing touch with their younger populations? We see the protest over Navalny and the anti-Putin street protests sweeping Russia that are being put down very forcefully. Do you see youth? We've had nationwide protests in Iran, but is this likely to continue? And there's clearly no ceiling on what the Iranian government is willing to do to put those protests down as well.
Yeah, I think Russia and Iran have that in common, that their governments are prepared to act ruthlessly against any opposition. And obviously, they don't like the fact that there's this, massive younger opposition to them. But so long as these governments control their security forces, then I don't think that they will be threatened. Now, the real issue is, does the spirit of opposition that has infected the youth, will this ever infect the security services? Because that's in fact, sort of the recipe for revolution, in other countries. In other words, it's the regime's armed forces are always strong enough to defeat the opposition. It's when the regime's armed forces become infected with the spirit of opposition themselves that this doesn't happen. And so, I think that in Iran and in Russia, the regimes have gone to great lengths to make sure that this does not happen. And so far, it's worked out for them. Now, something could happen, and it'll be very surprising if it does. It always is. And these things can change very, very quickly. All it would take, would be the defection of a general, a unit commander, him and his men going over to the other side, and then the rest of the armed forces being being confronted with the prospect of fighting, fellow soldiers like themselves. And what happens is that, a lot of defections might happen if someone, goes over. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And I think these governments, they haven't gotten rid of opposition, but they're firmly in charge of the security services. And so
Yeah,
long as they are, they'll be in power.
yeah, you don't see the Berlin Wall coming down until it does.
That's right.
Speaking of divisions in Iran, Robert says that he's read the Revolutionary Guard and the current leadership, President Rouhani, no longer see eye to eye. And you talked about the Zarif disclosure, and part of that was how he felt that he was somewhat intimidated is probably too strong a word, but put upon by Revolutionary Guard elements in some of the things he was made aware of or spoke about. Is a conflictive split imminent? We've got the elections coming up. But what's your read on Iranian domestic leadership issues?
Yeah, I don't think the civilian government has any prospect of dislodging the Revolutionary Guards. I think that what we're, if there's going to be any kind of change, it's going to become a more overtly Revolutionary Guard regime, it seems to me. That, that's not going to become more of a democracy, at least not at this point. So, and then, will they keep this a supreme leader, sort of like the Tokugawas kept the Japanese emperor, sort of a figurehead, or what? I have this sense that what we may see is the Revolutionary Guards more overtly in charge, especially once the current supreme leader passes away. As he's in his 80s, he's not well. People have been saying for years that he has to go. Well, eventually he has to go. But I have a feeling that the Revolutionary Guards are probably going to become even stronger at that point.
Well, you may, I'm sure you recall in 2015 when King Abdullah died, everyone was saying that King Salman was not long for his rule, and here we are in 2021.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. Whenever people are sure that someone is not long for this world, it's almost a recipe that actually they probably are. They seem to manage to hang on, and they'll be saying it about. They are saying it about Putin, but he's not that old. He's just 2 years older than me, so he's pretty young. He could hang on for another 2036. He's talking about. So yeah, these guys are amazingly long-lived, or can be.
Right, and nobody imagines what it would be like without them, and then suddenly, in some cases, they're gone. Bilal Al-Akras has a couple of questions here, but I'll cut to the second one first. To what extent has the Russian-Iran military cooperation in Syria influenced Russia's relation with Turkey? And that's kind of the new presence in the region as Ankara looks to its east and has a stunted relationship with the Europeans and the United States. So Turkey in this mix of Russia, Iran, Syria, Middle East intrigue, what should we be looking at?
Well, the Russian-Turkish relationship, if anything, it's more convoluted than the Russian-Iranian relationship, because what we see is, obviously Turkey a NATO ally, but being far, more and more cooperative with Russia, more and more, animosity toward America and the West, and yet we see the Russians and the Turks on opposing sides in Syria. We saw this in Libya. We saw this past year in the revived Nagorno-Karabakh dispute, and the Turks, giving tremendous support to the Azeris and helping them basically prevail. And this, to me, is just amazing. That, in other words, that Turkey has played a much larger role in the Caucasus. And now we hear reports of the Turks supporting the Ukrainians. And I think for the Russians, this is just, absolutely no go. So, I wonder just how long the Russians and the Turks can keep up with this cooperation. And I think it sort of the only thing that saves the relationship is that the Turkish leader Erdogan is so hot and bothered about the United States that, no matter, Russia still working with Russia looks good for him. I think it's a very volatile situation because Turkey's clearly pursuing its own regional great power strategy. And I think it's, uh, basically they've decided that the Americans are perhaps a spent force in the region. And as we've seen elsewhere, part of the America's alliance relationships, we have so many allies, it's not just simply about defending our allies against common adversaries. Part of the purpose of our alliances is to tamp down animosity among our allies. In other words, that we help keep the peace among them. And if the US is no longer considered strong, well, these animosities can flare up. And I think what we're seeing is that, there are some of America's allies in the Middle East, they see Turkey as more of a problem than Russia. And that I think is, I think that American diplomacy really needs to work on this, on smoothing over relations between Turkey and America's other allies. Otherwise, I think it's going to be very difficult for us, and it just gives the Russians an opportunity to meddle. That's for sure.
Yeah. Bilal has a second question here, and I'll mention that he was kind to thank you for your insights, and we reiterate that as well. He asks about Israel, and you talked about Israel a little bit, but we know that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu had close personal relations, and now that President Trump is gone, we noticed at the beginning of the Biden administration, the president kind of iced Bibi a little bit by not including him in the early phone calls or any sort of reaching out. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has been a frequent flyer to Moscow over the last couple of years. So and no one is naive enough to think that the Israel-United States relationship is not on solid foundations, but clearly there's some rustling in the leaves here. What should we be thinking about as we look forward in coming months to developments in Israel? It's got its own complex domestic political situation right now.
Well, it's an interesting question because certainly the Russian-Israeli relationship is, something that was unusual. That before Putin, there really wasn't a very good relationship at all. But that this is something that Putin has been very interested, and of course, Russian-speaking Israelis politicians have worked on this, and in many respects, Netanyahu has become the Putin whisperer, if you will. And to what extent are we seeing a good Russian-Israeli relationship, or is it a Putin-Netanyahu relationship? Now, I would think that any alternative to Netanyahu as Israeli prime minister is also going to pursue a calm relationship with Russia. That they're going to be very solicitous. They're going to want to keep the deconfliction agreement going in Syria so that the Israelis can pound Hezbollah and Iranian targets, and the Russians, not get upset about it. So I think these will continue, but whether there's the same warmth in the relationship, and of course whether it can survive Putin, is simply not clear at all. And certainly, Israeli diplomats whom I've spoken to in the past, that they also, feel that it's really more a Putin-Netanyahu relationship than a Russian-Israeli one, and so they're not quite sure, what's going to happen.
Okay, we're close on time here, so I'll thank our audience for their questions, and I'm going to ask the last one here, Mark. So in the memo to President Biden that you and I will write at the end of this webinar, what would our recommendations for U.S. approaches to Iran and to Russia in view of their relationship with one another? Is there a card that can be played here? And if so, which way would you recommend leaning?
Well, I think that what the Russians are trying to say is that America can't talk with Iran, but we can, we the Russians can, and we can talk with everyone. Therefore, we the Russians are in a better position to help you resolve your conflicts, although they somehow never managed to do this. Now, the United States has had some experience with Middle East conflict resolution, the Camp David Accords, which are still going, decades later. And what I really think is that as admirable as these Abraham Accords are, it's a much lesser feat to help bring peace among our varying allies than it is between our allies and our adversaries. I personally feel that at some point, what the US should attempt to do, something that Russia really can't or won't, that we should try to help bring about, if not peace, at least a détente between the Iranians on the one hand and our Arab and Israeli allies on the other. That would be a very, very difficult task, but we are in a better position to attempt it because I think the Russians really aren't, and I think that's our strength, is that we are better at conflict resolution than the Russians are. They're good at tactical ceasefires, in Syria, whatever, Assad and them surround a city, they let the they let the insurgents, take taxis or buses to somewhere else to fight again, and then of course war breaks out again. That's what they do, and they do it pretty well. But they're not good at establishing peace. And in one sense, certainly from the Cold War, the old adage is that Moscow can't afford peace, because if there really is peace in the region, then who needs Moscow? They only need, so. This is Chief Meteorologist Danielle Breezy, and you have a anyway, that was interesting. That's what I think that we should try to do. It will be monumentally difficult, and I'm not quite sure this administration can do it. But that I think would help everyone if we can bring it about.
Well, it sounds like you and your colleagues inside the Beltway will be busy with sorting through all of these things as you've done so expertly over the years. Thank you, Professor Mark Katz, Professor of Government and Policy at the Schar School at George Mason University, and a non-resident scholar at the Rafiq Hariri Center of the Atlantic Council in Washington, and a friend of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Mark, we're looking forward to seeing you on Lower Broadway here, down in the honky tonks, and out to schools and visits and a global town hall when we get back to in-person events.
Thanks, and thanks to the Kennan Institute for the sponsoring the Kennan Conversations and for bringing us together in the first place. Wonderful, wonderful group, that's for sure.
Great, and thanks to everybody for being with us tonight. Again, please consider becoming a member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council or making a donation to the council. That's how we pay the light bill and keep these programs going. So take a look at tnwac.org for your chance to join or to make a donation. Thank you very much. And again, Professor Mark Katz, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Everyone have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.